Former President Donald Trump has once again placed NATO's energy policies in the spotlight by urging its member nations to stop purchasing oil and gas from Russia immediately. According to Trump, the continued flow of money from NATO allies into Moscow's energy sector is effectively financing Russia's war in Ukraine. He argued that buying Russian oil while simultaneously condemning the war sends a conflicting message that weakens NATO's position both morally and strategically. Trump insisted that this dependency is not only a matter of economics but also of security, as it gives Russia leverage over European countries that rely on its energy exports. By calling for a full stop to Russian oil imports, Trump is advocating for what he sees as the most direct and effective way to cut off Russia's war funding. He also highlighted the importance of energy independence for NATO allies, stressing that a shift to alternative suppliers and domestic production could strengthen the alliance in the long run. Critics note, however, that such a move could be highly disruptive, given Europe's reliance on Russian energy. Energy analysts warn that cutting off Russian supplies too quickly could result in severe shortages, spiking energy prices, and economic instability. Yet, Trump has framed the move as a necessary sacrifice, urging NATO to show unity and strength against Moscow. In his view, the immediate pain caused by energy shifts would be outweighed by the long-term strategic benefit of depriving Russia of billions in oil revenue. His remarks signal a demand for NATO to go beyond symbolic gestures and adopt bold, coordinated economic measures to undermine Russia's ability to continue its war. Trump also proposed that NATO nations collectively impose extraordinary tariffs of 50% to 100% on Chinese goods, a move that would amount to one of the most aggressive economic measures ever suggested against Beijing. He argued that China's role in indirectly supporting Russia through trade and diplomatic cover makes it complicit in prolonging the conflict in Ukraine. According to Trump, slapping tariffs on Chinese imports would serve as both punishment and deterrent, sending a message that economic cooperation with Moscow will carry heavy costs. Unlike permanent trade wars, he framed this idea as temporary, stressing that the tariffs would be fully withdrawn once the war in Ukraine comes to an end. This condition, he argued, would give China an incentive to pressure Russia toward negotiations, effectively making Beijing part of the solution rather than the problem. Trump's call for such tariffs also underscores his long-standing belief in using trade as a weapon of leverage, a theme that defined much of his previous presidency. Analysts point out that tariffs of this magnitude could disrupt global supply chains, raise consumer prices across NATO nations, and provoke retaliation from China. However, Trump's supporters believe the move would demonstrate unprecedented Western unity and show that NATO is not only a military alliance but also a powerful economic coalition capable of reshaping global trade. His proposal is already stirring debate among policymakers, with some describing it as impractical and others praising it as a bold strategy to end the war more quickly. Trump's insistence that the proposed tariffs on China be temporary rather than permanent reflects a deliberate attempt to tie economic measures directly to geopolitical outcomes. He explained that once the war between Russia and Ukraine concludes, either through peace negotiations or a decisive end to hostilities, the tariffs would be completely lifted. This framing is important because it redefines tariffs not as long-term trade barriers but as bargaining chips in a broader diplomatic strategy. Trump's reasoning is that if China sees a clear pathway for the tariffs to be removed, it may be more inclined to use its influence over Moscow to bring about an end to the war. By connecting economic penalties to the resolution of the conflict, Trump is also signaling to NATO allies that the goal is not to permanently destabilize global trade but to use temporary economic pressure to achieve peace. Supporters view this as a clever way of ensuring that sanctions are not simply punitive but outcome-oriented, designed to achieve a specific end. Critics, however, warn that even temporary tariffs of 50% to 100% could create massive economic shockwaves that may not be easily reversed once lifted. Economists note that markets often take years to adjust to such disruptions, meaning consumers and industries could face lasting consequences. Yet Trump maintains that the costs of a temporary disruption are minor compared to the ongoing devastation of the war. By explicitly linking tariffs to the war's conclusion, he is reframing economic policy as a weapon of diplomacy, positioning NATO not only as a security alliance but as a collective body capable of influencing major world powers through coordinated financial pressure. The suggestion of NATO embracing tariffs and trade restrictions as part of its strategy marks a fundamental shift in how the alliance could operate. Traditionally, NATO has functioned as a purely military and defense-oriented organization, focusing on collective security in the face of external threats. Trump's proposal introduces an entirely new dimension, one in which NATO would wield economic tools alongside military preparedness. This expansion of NATO's role would mean that the alliance is no longer limited to troop deployments and deterrence strategies but could also engage in coordinated economic warfare. Trump and his supporters argue that such a step is long overdue, as modern conflicts are not fought solely on the battlefield but also through economic channels, where sanctions and tariffs can be just as impactful as military power. Analysts point out that using NATO as a vehicle for economic measures could radically alter global diplomacy, as it would turn the alliance into a force capable of dictating both security and trade norms. However, skeptics question whether all member nations would be willing to accept such a transformation, given their varied economic interests and dependencies. Countries with deeper trade ties to China, for example, may resist using tariffs as a political weapon. Still, Trump's framing of NATO as both a military and economic coalition taps into a growing recognition that wars today are multifaceted, involving financial leverage, supply chain control, and technological competition. If adopted, this approach could set a precedent for NATO to intervene in future global crises not just with troops and weapons but also with economic strategies designed to cripple adversaries. Economists and trade experts are raising alarms over the potential consequences of tariffs as steep as 100% on Chinese imports, warning that the fallout could be swift and widespread across NATO nations. China is deeply embedded in global supply chains, serving as the leading supplier of consumer electronics, machinery, textiles, and countless other goods essential to Western markets. Doubling the cost of imports from China would almost certainly trigger a sharp rise in consumer prices, hitting households already struggling with inflation. Industries reliant on Chinese parts and materials, from automotive manufacturing to technology, could face severe disruptions, leading to production delays, job losses, and an overall slowdown in economic growth. Beyond domestic concerns, analysts suggest that China would not sit idly by. Instead, Beijing could retaliate by restricting exports of critical minerals and components, many of which are vital to NATO economies, such as rare earth elements used in advanced electronics and defense technologies. This tit-for-tat escalation could quickly evolve into a trade war of unprecedented scale, with ripple effects across global markets. At the same time, supporters of Trump's plan argue that the temporary pain would be worth the price if it hastened the end of the war in Ukraine by cutting off indirect support to Moscow. They contend that China's central role in international trade also gives NATO significant leverage. If the West bands together to limit access to their markets, China would have little choice but to reconsider its policies toward Russia. The debate highlights the tension between short-term economic stability and long-term strategic security, forcing NATO nations to weigh immediate costs against the possibility of accelerating peace in Eastern Europe. Reactions to Trump's proposal have been mixed, reflecting both the boldness of the idea and its potential risks. Within NATO, some officials have privately acknowledged that expanding the alliance's role into economic pressure could provide a powerful tool against adversaries, showing that NATO is not limited to military responses alone. Yet others remain cautious, noting that NATO is a defense alliance, not a trade bloc, and that consensus on such drastic measures would be difficult to achieve given the differing economic ties members hold with China. European nations with heavy reliance on Chinese markets, such as Germany, may be reluctant to embrace tariffs that would directly harm their industries. Political analysts also suggest that Trump's call for collective tariffs may be aimed partly at bolstering his own image ahead of upcoming elections, portraying him as a leader unafraid to challenge both China and Russia simultaneously. Internationally, Beijing has yet to issue a formal response, but experts anticipate strong condemnation if NATO countries begin discussing tariffs at an official level. Chinese officials are likely to frame such actions as unjust economic coercion, potentially rallying other nations to their side in global trade forums. Meanwhile, in the United States, the proposal has sparked partisan debate, with Trump's allies hailing it as a bold stroke of strategic thinking and his critics dismissing it as reckless and economically unsustainable. The larger question looming over these reactions is whether NATO itself is ready to evolve into an organization that combines economic might with military strength. If the idea gains traction, it could redefine the alliance's role in the 21st century, setting the stage for a new era of economic and geopolitical warfare.